All right, so this is going to be a traditional Enneagram lesson. And the Enneagram is kind of controversial. Honestly, I don't know why people can't get it. Actually, I do know why, but it's frustrating that they still don't get it. That when you tell them that you should really go back and study Ichazo and Naranjo, who are considered the mother and father of the Enneagram. If you don't study the mother and the father, then how are you supposed to type yourself accurately? Early on, they talked about fixation, which is completely different from type, as it turns out. It's not supposed to be different, but it ends up being different enough that you really need to separate the two and see how the early model really is the root. Think about it. This is the origin. If you study origins and how the lineage of something, the ancestor is a single ancestor. It comes from one source. It's not like the Enneagram came together from different sources. If you go to Riso and Hudson, which is probably the most popular author, trace the lineage back. Figure out, what they added, what was just their own ideas. It's a little bit difficult to explain because there's some advanced logic that you have to do. And the Enneagram is a very logical system, and it's mathematical. It's simple, but it's deceptively simple. There are 9 fixations, and the original model, if you want to consider Ichazo's version, the original model, is the simplest. And let me just go through it real quick. There's a trifix. That means we have one core type in one center, and we have 2 non-core fixations in the other 2 centers. Those 3 centers are the head, heart, and gut triads. They have other names as well. Ichazo called them conservation for the gut triad, relation for the heart triad, and adaptation for the head triad, to my recollection. So the names changed, but the underlying ideas did not change. And that's crucial, because the reason the names changed were so that people didn't have to copyright it, so that they could do what they wanted with it. Ichazo was very controlling about the Enneagram. He was very strict about his Enneagram. And he methodically, thoroughly tested it, taught it, disseminated it throughout South America for a couple decades, approximately 2 decades. He did this, and it was a working model. It worked just great. So later on, you get people sort of reinventing the wheel. And I'm not sharing that original model, just talking a little bit about what it was, but it wasn't disseminated. The original model was kept in the Eureka School, and I think until like 1 or 2 years ago, you couldn't even access those ideas. So anybody that studies the Enneagram should logically want to read that material. It literally contains the ideas that inspired all of the types, all of the variations on different authors' interpretations of the types. Sandra Maitre, Riso and Hudson, Richard Rohr, Helen Palmer, Catherine Favre, Beatrice Chestnut, anybody that you can think of. Because it started with Naranjo, you see. His school split off into all of these different parts. So logically, wouldn't you want to study his school? You could pick. The reason I laugh is because people just don't seem to get it. And they don't realize that when you pick and choose your favorite from that wheel that splits off from a Chazo, this is inferior logically, morally, ethically. It's not a matter of what you want. It's not a matter of what you choose. It is a simple law of logic and mathematics that if you trace the passions of each type. Now, what are the passions? The passions actually incidentally go back to Gurdjieff. So that is an even more common thread. You need to take all of these strands. Picture you have 50 strands of Enneagram authors in the modern space, which there probably are. I think there are about 50 of them approximately that you could dig up. And okay, let's say that these are post-Ichazoan, post-Naranjoan authors. Literally all of those trace back to Chazo, every single one of them. So if you like one of them and really love it and are in love with it, it's probably because you're biased and because that author is biased. Trace back to a Chazo and you get the passions, you get the centers, you get a whole lot of other cool stuff, common elements that you can, trace to different authors and descriptions, but you're going to want to find that key. That's almost like the Rosetta Stone for the entire thing. And it's not my opinion. It's not something that's up for debate. It's just a simple fact of logic that if you study this thing, that's how it works. That's how history works. That's how knowledge in this space has been disseminated. So, it's something to think about. All right. Okay. So continuing on that, I want that to make sense. I want people really, really to understand that concretely. And because it's essential. It's so basic and it's so essential. And if you don't get it, you're not going to understand this thing at all. You're just not. So go ahead and do that. Buy his Chazo's books. Treat it like a course. Treat it like a college class. They're a little bit expensive. Yeah, they're dry, whatever, but it's philosophy. It's not just pop personality type stuff. That stuff was just inspired by the core material. It was more like philosophy, and there's a great deal of spirituality in it. Go back and study a Chazo, and you'll see the passions of the types. I'll go through them all in a minute, and also you will see, of course, the triads. I'll go through those again. All those are also common to Gurdjieff. So it's interesting. It's interesting to study a Chazo as well and see the people that he studied, because he was really quite a polymath, and he studied many, many different disciplines, spiritual traditions and philosophy from so many different sources. So the Enneagram was his life's work, and it was a culmination of many, many different schools of thought. But it's important to see that his original modern Enneagram was where all the modern Enneagram ideas came from, basically. It's very conceptual, the Enneagram, and he knew what he was doing when he created it. That's why it worked so well. But you should also go back and study Gurdjieff, because he was the next stop along the way, going back in time. I've studied this in depth. I've taken quite a bit of time to do it, and it is deep. It's not something you pick up overnight. It's really not. So let's go through Ichazo's versions of the types. And these are the core types. The type 1 was the perfectionist, and this has the passion of wrath from the Bible, of the 7 deadly sins. It's wrath, anger, resentment is how it plays out. The reason why it plays out as resentment is because anger, wrath in its raw, unbridled form does not adhere to perfection. So Chazo defined both the 1 and the 8 as similar because they're both going for something that is impossible to achieve. They have a very high standard, and they're going for an impossible something that's just impossible, an impossible ideal. In the case of the 1, it's perfection. The way I look at perfection with the 1 is it's meeting something to a very, very high standard. It is not really a black or white thing. There's gray area as it improves and improves, and then all of a sudden, you reach perfection. The idea is to reach perfection, but you really can't ever get there. It's like you're cleaning the floor and you just keep finding another speck. So the more the 1 starts to, look for it, the harder it is for them to feel they've achieved it. And they become angry, resentful, because they can't express that anger, because that anger is not perfect. So this is the cycle. Each of the types, each of the fixations is a cycle. It is a rather simple cycle, but that's what's at the core of the fixation, and subsequently the personality type portraits that were derived from the fixation. You should look at the portraits as derivations, and the fixations as the core raw material, the seeds. So the 1 is a perfectionist. They become resentful when they aren't perfect, when their world isn't perfect. The theory behind this is in childhood, in their development, not that it was caused by this, but all of the types have a predisposition towards a worldview, perceiving situations in a certain light. So the 1 perceived that they were never good enough. And this was usually, attributed to authority figures, parents, important people in their lives. Chazo liked to have it represented by the mother, a mother figure generally who was cold and critical. But these aren't literal. These are just theories. The big idea behind it is that the child felt they were never good enough. And this led to the disciplined, perfectionistic style of the 1, and that is the fixation of the 1. Next up in the gut triad is, we'll go to the other side, which is the 8, kind of opposite to the 1. This is an exploded type. The 1 pulls inward, and the 8 pushes outward. The 1 is all tightened up, more tightened up and rigid, doesn't express their sin. Whereas the 8 expresses it excessively, pushes out the body, the instincts. Okay? The instinctive triad are about how I feel, my boundaries, my body, my experience, immediate action, the state of things, what's going on a very, very basic, essential level, hence the identification with the instinctual body triad. Okay, now the 8 is also looking for something that is impossible. And it's, again, these are abstract ideals that these types are searching for. And with the 8 and the 1, they're looking for something impossible. And with the 8, it's justice. Justice is fairness. Things being equal, people being treated fairly. Often it's people getting what they want out of life. It depends on the individual. It could be, making sure everybody's getting the same treatment, or it could be making sure that people are giving me what I deserve, or what I want, or what I have a right to. The 8s can be very entitled, and they see justice in terms of themselves and outside of them. So kind of like the 1 looks for perfection externally and internally, the 8 does likewise with justice. So they're likely to be triggered by this feeling that this isn't fair, right? This isn't the way it should be, really. It's not about perfection, a high standard, a high quality of looking clean or being done to a high standard of excellence. That's the 1. With the 8, it's more about what's right. It really is what's right. And he called the 8 the moralist. Every description of the 8 from later on, the healthy 8 in Riso and Hudson is described as standing up for people, having a high moral fiber, they use examples. They like to use, pick celebrity examples of Martin Luther King or, certain presidents that were famous, that were really good presidents, like FDR, who stood up for good morals and fairness and justice. So you can see where this came from. It came directly from a Chazo. So the 8 is the moralist. All right. And the fixation here is lust, is excess. Okay. And this one is a little bit difficult to go into. It's a bit complicated. All of them are rather complicated in a way. It's about how they become upset when things aren't just, right? They want to punish. They want to react. They want to achieve justice. They want retribution and they want revenge. Okay, so the 8 is identified with justice and revenge. That is the core of the 8. You won't find this mentioned in later authors, but it's what they're all about. It's what they're all talking about. They just don't say it because it was copyrighted by a Chazo. Okay, so now we're getting to the root of it, is that this was his material. If you want to just take it back to Gurdjieff gave us a lust for the 8, but he hadn't attached vengeance to it yet. Vengeance came later on, and this was a Chazo's thing. He's responsible for it. He was the guru that gave us all of these ideas. It's obviously all the authors together culminate, but you want to understand the core of the types. And Naranjo, between these two guys, Naranjo, was the second guy, and he got together with the Chazo, and they developed the subtypes. They worked on Chazo's ideas together. They did some good, solid work together, but they quickly split up. They only worked together for about a year before Naranjo decided to go a different direction with it, because he was coming from a psychiatric perspective, a completely different perspective. So you can see that as different people got a hold of the Enneagram, they started wanting to do different things with it. They wanted to take it in different directions, and that was cool because it's the symbol itself you can't copyright. But they realized they had to change all the names, because once an author had written down the material and copyrighted their book with certain names in there, it was copyrighted. So the Enneagram itself wasn't. Some of the core ideas, go back to the Bible, you can't copyright the 7 deadly sins, you can't copyright the symbol, and you can't copyright stuff from Gurdjieff because he was from before copywriting. So these are modernity kinds of stuff to absorb and understand. So this is the way to study the Enneagram. This is the way. People may disagree, but that's because they're biased. They haven't actually studied it like this. I was that way too. We were all that way until we got a hold of Chazo's writing, and until we started to piece together Gurdjieff, Chazo, and Naranjo. Some people think Gurdjieff has nothing to do with it, but they're wrong, because Gurdjieff was the one that placed all the numbers around the Enneagram, defined the types and the centers, assigned the passions of the types, and also came up with some of the other big ideas, like the law of 3, that you have 3 directional poles, one that pushes forward, one that comes back, and that one's neutral, that shows up again and again and again in the Enneagram. The law of 7, which it actually connects to music. It's pretty fascinating. It connects to octaves in music and tonalities and vibrations. And the Enneagram is just very complex and fascinating. And people, they're not that smart. They learn it. They learn a simple version. They learn everything about R&H, and they think that's so cool, and they've memorized that, and they know the reactive types, and they know the withdrawn types, and all of them. I have all of that stuff memorized, by the way. It's not that I don't know that stuff. I know all of that stuff like the back of my hand. That's not the point. It's that you're going to get false positives by looking at that stuff. The best way to do it is to go back to the root, because that's what's underneath all of it. If you're going to go by, superego types, I'm a superego type. Honestly, I am, I feel, because I'm very moralistic. I'm a type 8. I'm an 8. I have lust. But how can you have lust? How can you have vengeance and be a type 8? Some people would say somehow I'm a 6, but that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because I know that I'm actually an 8. So people they'll give you false leads. It's not going to get you the answers you need. You're not going to actually figure out your type. It's like dealing with a pathological liar. If they tell you one thing, you have to look behind that and say, well, that doesn't add up. What's really going on? I mean, if the story doesn't make sense, it doesn't matter what the person says. If it contradicts itself, it's false. So you have to look at this stuff in terms of the logic behind it. The logic has to make sense. Okay. So that's kind of a quick version of the Enneagram, how to study it, how to get to the root of it. I put the time in because it matters to me. It took me a while to figure out that I was an 8. I thought I was different types, trying to go by Riso and Hudson and other authors, because they're not very good for diagnosing the types. Ichazo came up with the original model of self-diagnosis and the original system, and it does involve a trifix. The trifix is important. You really do need to get the other points right. You have to go over the whole thing with a fine-toothed comb and go over yourself with a fine-toothed comb. It's a deeper system than people would think. They don't give it enough credit. All of my problems can be traced to me going overboard and being excessive and going until the levee breaks, basically, overreacting, going to extremes, being excessive, being lustful. And often it's in response to feeling like I'm not being treated fairly or not getting what I want. Or sometimes it's for other people. Sometimes it's for everybody. It's for the situation in general that I just want it all, to work out together. But it is often selfish for the 8. We can be very selfish people, especially when it's a sexual energy. It's very hedonistic, wants sexual gratification, and wants to control and possess justice for oneself. So that's the way to type yourself and other people accurately. It can be hard to type other people accurately that way, but, the other authors are very good. It's good to read them. I think that sometimes they can be good for typing other people. I don't think they're as good for typing yourself. I think that we have a hard time typing ourselves. I think we're prone to mistyping ourselves. It's just, there are so many biases in most of the authors, and a good way to do it is to go back to the original authors and study Ichazo and Naranjo.